Welcome to my slideshow of an expedition that I made to Antarctica in February 2013. I'm using the photos that I took and my trip notes from my weblog, which is at wilsons.id.au. You can review this anytime if you wish, along with some of the other trips that I've made in my travels. I hope you enjoy watching it as much as I enjoy making it, and I look forward to any comments that you might like to leave. My trip would begin in Ushuaia, at the southern tip of South America in Argentina. We would sail to the Falkland Islands for a couple of days and then visit South Georgia Island. From there we would travel past Elephant Island down to the Antarctic Peninsula and return to Ushuaia to finish our trip. I reached Ushuaia by flying from Melbourne to Sydney, then to Santiago in Chile, and over to Buenos Aires in Argentina, where I had a very welcome overnight stop after 26 hours of travel. From there it was a 3.5-hour trip down to Ushuaia. Because of the increase in Antarctic travel, this little town has grown to something like 8 or 9 times its original size over the last 2 decades. I spent the morning walking around the town and along the harbour taking photos. I came across the same scuttled tug that I remembered from a previous visit, and at this time I found at the far end of town a large memorial to those who'd served in the Argentine forces in the Falkland Islands. The Argentinians are indeed a very nationalistic lot. I then spent a few hours in the prison museum, an old jail that's very similar to Pentridge back in Melbourne, and in fact it has a display that makes that comparison. Because of its isolation, Ushuaia was once a penal colony and was set up along the lines of Port Arthur in Tasmania for housing repeat offenders. Most of the prisoners' work here was cutting timber in the forest. In the afternoon, I took a tour along the Beagle Channel. This is the waterway which leads to the Drake Passage down to Antarctica and is named after the ship the Beagle, which was later made famous by Charles Darwin and captained by Fitzroy. In fact, a major peak in the Andes is named after him. We passed some remote farms and then ended up at the lighthouse, which is one of the southernmost lighthouses in the world. Returning to Ushuaia, we stopped at some little islands which were breeding grounds for the royal cormorant, and some with a colony of sea lions. We had some great views over the channel and the surrounding mountains, which form the bottom end of the Andes. On February the 6th, my second day in Ushuaia, I spent the day in Tierra del Fuego National Park, about 12 kilometres to the west of Ushuaia. Our day started in Ensenada Bay, where there is a little jetty with a post office and an immigration point. We then began an 8-kilometre walk along the coast around the road to Lapataya Bay, which is famous as the endpoint of the Transamerica Highway, which begins in Alaska over 17,800 kilometres to the north. We walked around beaches, over headlands, up and down gullies, and got some beautiful view of the Beagle Channel. We found a couple of sites along the way where the original inhabitants of this area had lived, the Yagan people. They were nomadic and survived on the natural resources of the sea. They lived by the beaches and made voyages into the sea in canoes made of beach. They hunted sea lions and collected shellfish. They lived in huts made of tree branches and trunks and clothed themselves with leather made from sea lion pelts. They smeared their body with the fat and the grease of these animals to waterproof their skins. The trouble for these people began in 1880 when European missionaries entered the area. They tried to shift the native people's diet to Western foods such as potatoes, but these did not provide sufficient calories for them. Other early settlers brought disease, and this resulted in a rapid and nearly complete extinction of the Argan people. The tribe was reduced in number from about 3,000 people in 1880 to less than 100 by the 1990s. There is now only one sole survivor, a woman in her 90s. We had an unexpected part of the day. I knew there was a water component in this trip, and I expected it to be in a Zodiac. Instead, I found that it was to be in inflatable canoes. After donning rubber boots, waterproof pants and a life jacket, we set off in groups of 4 to paddle 5 kilometres from the lake back to Lapataya Bay. We were helped a bit by the river current, although the last 500 metres was a hard slog against the wind and across the open waters of the bay. Today is February the 7th, an embarkation day for our sailing to Antarctica. The little wharf here is surprisingly busy and has been full of large trawlers and container ships over the last few days. Today there are only passenger ships. The large one to the right is the Star Princess, which I travelled on once on a journey on the Inside Passage to Alaska. It's around 109,000 tonnes. The little white ship with the blue and red stripes is the Sergei Vavilov, and it displaces only 6,000 tonnes. It's just 1/18 of the size of the Star Princess and looks tiny by comparison. We'll have about 105 passengers on this trip. We spent February the 8th at sea with 4-metre swells as we sailed west to the Falkland Islands. This time gave us plenty of opportunities to photograph birds in flight, like the petrels and albatross that followed the ship. On the morning of February the 9th, we had our first landing for this trip. It was at West Point Island in the eastern Falklands. Because of the tides, we needed to be in and out of this bay by 10 a.m. And on this type of expedition, there's no rigid agenda, you just have to be flexible. West Point Island is owned by a very stoic sheep farmer. We walked across his land for half an hour to some cliffs on the other side to get a view of some black-browed albatross in their breeding area. These birds mate for life, and they were nesting waiting for their chicks to hatch. Nearby we found a group of rockhopper penguins. These are the smallest of the crested penguins and weigh about 3 kilograms. Their population is in decline. They live all around the subantarctic islands, and as their decline is especially so in the Falklands. After lunch back on the ship, we visited Carcass Island to see Magellanic penguins. These birds are about twice the size of the rockhoppers, and most are molting when we were there. They have a band of black feathers like an inverted horseshoe, which runs up each side of their chest and across the bottom of their chin. This area here really is a birdwatcher's paradise. We walked for about an hour around the bay to another farmhouse where we had a delicious afternoon tea, and then we were back to the ship to have a quiet few hours before dinner. We have a very special guest on this ship. At the time of my trip, a group of adventurers were recreating Shackleton's voyage from Elephant Island to South Georgia. This was the route that Shackleton took in trying to find a rescue for his men in 1912 when his ship, the Endurance, was crushed by winter ice. He was trying to be the first to cross the entire Antarctic continent. The modern-day adventurers are using the same type of clothing as used by Shackleton and in an exact replica of his boat. We'll see Shackleton's grave in South Georgia and expect to meet these adventurers when they arrive at Grytviken, an old whaling station and now the administration centre for South Georgian government. Shackleton's granddaughter Alexandra is travelling with us on the ship. She is the patron of the Shackleton Foundation, and we're interested in a talk that she will give sometime during our voyage about Sir Ernest Shackleton and his life. She is the daughter of his son, who was only 10 years of age when Shackleton died. Therefore, she never met her famous grandfather. Overnight, our ship had relocated to Port Stanley. After clearing customs and immigration, we had all day to explore the town. We started with a nature excursion to Gypsy Cove. There wasn't much wildlife here, just a few Magellanic penguins. However, of historical interest, the bay was fenced off with signs warning of possible landmines left in place after the Falklands War of 1982. I don't know whether they would have been British mines or Argentinian ones, but the effects would still be the same. On a ridge above the harbour is a gun emplacement that protected Port Stanley in World War II. The shoreline of the bay is dotted with old shipwrecks. Many of these are old sailing boats that limped into here after being damaged while rounding Cape Horn. There is even a mast from the ship the Great Britain that was designed and built by Brunel. The main street of Port Stanley is spread out along the harbour. We walked to a museum which was about 2 kilometres out of the town and along the other way from the pier as well. The town is based around a street network of 4 or 5 roads that run behind and parallel to the shore. There are still many areas where mines had not been cleared. Overall, the flavour of the city and the style of its houses struck me as being very similar to that of an English seaside village. The police look the same as the British, as do the customs officers. It looks just like a little piece of England that has been transplanted to the other side of the world. We spent the 13th of February at sea, travelling to South Georgia. We had a compulsory talk about the rules for visiting Antarctica and South Georgia, and they included things like no taking of food ashore where wrappers and plastic can be blown away, no smoking, return to the ship if you need to go to the toilet, don't go within 5 metres of any wildlife or do anything that would cause it to change its natural behaviour, wash guano off clothing in seawater before getting into zodiacs and the ship, ensure that outer clothing is cleaned every time you return to the ship and boots are sterilised and disinfectant, don't walk on moss beds or areas of other delicate vegetation, and don't remove anything. We even had our pockets vacuumed to remove any seeds or things that might contaminate the local environment. We were still at sea on February the 14th. We had crossed the Antarctic Convergence, which is where the cold, dense Antarctic water meets the warmer Atlantic Ocean water. The temperature had dropped to about 2 degrees and it was getting cool. The air is more moist and we've been surrounded by light fog. We sailed past shag rocks at a distance of about 1.5 miles but couldn't see anything of them. On the next morning, we were up early at 5 a.m. for our first landing on South Georgia, which was at the Bay of Isles at Salisbury Plain, the home of one of the largest king penguin colonies in the world. It was foggy and drizzling, and we had all our wet weather gear on as we headed off in our zodiacs. We were about 1 kilometre from the shore, and when we landed, we found ourselves right in the middle of thousands of king penguins on the beach. The 5 metre rule of distance was very hard to follow, so all we could do was be very careful as we walked around. These are quite beautiful birds. Their black head and red beak and golden flash on the side of the head, along with their stippled silver back and white body, makes them look stunning. They stand about 80 to 90 centimetres tall. Along the beach were a number of Antarctic fur seals. They're gorgeous little fluffy creatures with beautiful big brown eyes. If the weather had been dry, they'd look probably more cute, but as it was in the drizzle, they looked wet and bedraggled. When I stood on the beach, I could see a sea of penguins in both directions that stretched for a kilometre from where I was standing. The main colony would have been 500 metres wide and stretched inland for over a kilometre. There are over 100,000 breeding pairs here. It's just a stunning sight. We were back on the ship for a late breakfast at 9 a.m, and then it was time to move on to Pryan Island. This is one of the few nesting places of the wandering albatross. We anchored about 2 kilometres offshore and travelled across to the island in zodiacs through large swells that were well over a metre high. It was raining constantly. We reached the shore after navigating through some thick beds of giant kelp, the fastest growing plant in the world. On the rocks around the island were hundreds of fur seals. They seemed to be very playful, popping up in many places, having a look, and then diving to pop up somewhere else. Among them were a few white ones. Their pale colour was formed by recessive genes that left them with blonde fur. Today, on February the 14th, we had another change of plan. Instead of visiting Stromness and Furness Bays, we had to go somewhere else because the government wouldn't let us land because they were carrying out a rat eradication program and didn't want visitors interfering with the movement of ships and helicopters. There is an old whaling station at Stromness, but access is prohibited because of a large amount of asbestos. Instead, we visited Jonas Harbour in pouring rain. We were out in zodiacs at 9 a.m, landing at a little shingle beach near a group of fur seals and a small colony of king penguins. Near where we landed is an old hut which was built by a whaler as a refuge in 1901. It was fitted out with a couple of bunks, bench, table and cupboards, and just behind the hut along a muddy section of the tussock grass was a wallow of elephant seals. These are big animals, weighing over a tonne each. In the afternoon, our plan was to go to Grytviken, but the Shackleton Recreation Expedition wouldn't be there until the following day, so we had to change our plan so that we wouldn't miss them. The weather had become finer and the sun was out, and there was almost no wind. We decided that we would spend the afternoon in Cumberland Bay, a large bay on the south of South Georgia that offered some excellent scenery and interesting things to do. We left the ship in the middle of the bay and headed towards the entrance where a couple of large icebergs were grounded on the shore. As with other icebergs we've seen, they required a close inspection and photograph from every angle. Leaving the icebergs, we cruised up the shore and past the ship to see more fur seals, the king penguin colony in a lovely green valley with a freshwater stream and backed up by tall mountains with a waterfall. As we continued along the coast, we came to a large broad glacier covered in dirty rock moraine. It looked as if it was covered in volcanic ash, as we'd seen in glaciers in Iceland, but it was just a lot of ground-up rock. Further around, in a broad inlet, was the highlight of the cruise, another glacier coming from some steep mountains which we estimated to be over 5,000 feet high. The height of the face of this glacier was hard to estimate, as everything around it was on an enormous scale. Perhaps it was 250 metres. It was a splendid scene. By now the wind was picking up, so we headed back to the ship. It took half an hour to cover the 3 or 4 kilometres of distance, but we were back safely after 5 o'clock. Tonight we have an outside barbecue on the deck. On the 15th of February, we were back at Grytviken to try another entry into the harbour. It was a nice sunny day and 8 degrees Celsius. But this caused a high level of temperature difference between our position at sea level and the mountains in the centre of South Georgia. The katabatic winds were blowing at up to 45 knots, and it was too dangerous to enter the harbour. Because we couldn't enter Grytviken harbour, we moved further down the coast to a little sheltered bay called Grundholt Bay. We anchored in the centre of the bay, and then we set about exploring it in zodiacs. On the western shore was the remains of an old whaling station. In this bay, whaling was done on factory ships with shore facilities being used to store oil and other whaling byproducts. Some old storage tanks and lots of 400-gallon drums were still sitting by the shore. After a quick visit, we potted around in zodiacs, cruising between some large icebergs that were beached on the shore and observing the wildlife. By early afternoon, we were back in Grytviken harbour. We entered through the heads to find the old administration offices on our right and the cemetery where Shackleton's grave to our left. Once the ship was cleared by customs, Tim Jarvis, the leader of the Shackleton Recreation Expedition, came on board for an introduction and a warm welcome. Our first activity was to zodiac to the cemetery for a toast to both Sir Ernest Shackleton and the expedition which had successfully recreated his feats. There's a very tidy little cemetery on the side of a hill in which Sir Ernest, his 2IC Frank Wild, and a number of mostly Norwegian sealers and whalers are buried. Some elephant seals have created a wallow right outside the cemetery gate, and they interrupted our short service with their grunting, burping and farting. Once the service was over, we walked around to the whaling station, the museum and the post office. This meant running the gauntlet of angry fur seals who didn't like us getting too close to them. The whaling station is just as it was when it closed down in the 1960s. Some of the buildings have been removed because they contained asbestos, but the plant, machinery, tanks and equipment is still in its original places. There are 3 old whale chasers that have been run up onto the shore and are slowly rusting away. The site is very industrial with machines, old boilers, engines, interspersed with industrial litter such as chains and girders and bits of assorted steel. I took a lot of photos here, hoping to catch some of the character of this place, and I actually thought it was one of the highlights of our visit to South Georgia. February 16th is our last day in South Georgia. We were awake at 6 to go out early in zodiacs to visit Gold Harbour, where there were thousands of king penguins on the long strip of beach. There were some gentoo penguins as well. These are smaller penguins with a bright red beak and a white patch on their heads. There were 20 or so elephant seals on the beach. These were very interesting. They were young males. Like walruses, they all lie close to each other to maintain bodily contact, except for some sporadic times when they would test their strength with each other in some form of combative behaviour. This resulted in them rearing upwards chest to chest and growling at each other with a deep rushing gurgle and a rumbling growl. When they are adult and defending a harem of perhaps up to 40 females on the beach, they are known as beachmasters, and then their behaviour will be much more aggressive as they protect their herd of women. While we were watching the seals and the penguins, we were also having to avoid hundreds of fur seals who occupied the beach. The young ones would bound up to us in an inquisitive manner, which at times appeared aggressive, in order to check us out. A clap of our hands was enough to scare most of them away, but some needed a further kick of sand towards them. Our ship's doctor suffered a nip on his leg from an over-aggressive young one. The final part of our South Georgian experience was when we sailed along the very western part of the coastline of the island and into Drygalski Fjord. This was a stunning fjord with large mountains and glaciers. It was a fitting goodbye to this island before we head off tonight to Antarctica proper. I had studied geology at high school, and I was surprised at how much I can remember as we looked at the rock formations and landscape features along this fjord. February the 17th was a rough day at sea. We had waves of 7 metres and winds of 55 knots. The ship was rolling heavily in the heavy seas. Breakfast was fun, as when the ship rolled heavily from side to side, all the people at the buffet would lurch into the wall and then back to the central serving table as the ship rolled the other way. I sat in the lounge on the 6th deck for most of the day, as from there I could look out across the sea to the horizon and avoid feeling seasick. By lunchtime, the seas had eased to about 2 metres, and we were able, especially in the late afternoon, to see the blows of a number of whales. The 18th of February was a quiet day at sea with little of much interest. I spent some time on the bridge today. Ever since we'd left port, we have an open bridge and anyone can go there at any time. It's really become quite cold now. The outside temperature is less than 2 degrees, and anywhere where it's windy is really cold. Today we've had 30-knot winds, which have caused large swells, and the ship has been pitching into them regularly with quite a thud. There may have been a plan to visit the South Orkney Islands, but they're currently surrounded by a large volume of ice that has blown out from the Weddell Sea. They're impossible to get into. But maybe we should arrive at Elephant Island early tomorrow morning. We understand that the winds are forecast to increase, and our expedition leader has decided to make a run for the Antarctic Peninsula and have some shelter. No one disagrees with that. On February the 19th, we reached Elephant Island at about 6 in the morning to find it shrouded in heavy fog and a 30-knot wind blowing from the northwest. We had hoped to visit here because this is where Shackleton left his men before sailing off to South Georgia in his lifeboat to find rescue for them. We stopped for half an hour and decided that it was not good enough to launch Zodiacs, and there was no point in hanging around. We couldn't see anything in the fog, and the east coast of the island was iced in. So instead of our planned visit, we'll set sail straight to the Antarctic Peninsula. That means we have 3 straight days at sea now, but we also have an extra day to spend in Antarctica. Sometime this afternoon, the wind changed from the south and the temperature instantly dropped to -3 degrees. Towards dusk, we came across an enormous tabular iceberg that had blown across from the Weddell Sea. It must have been a mile long and rose out of the sea perhaps 100 metres. Recognising that only 1/10 of the ice is out of the water, this meant that this iceberg was nearly a kilometre in depth. On February the 20th, we woke up at the northern end of the Antarctic Peninsula in calm seas and bright skies. We had our first view of Antarctica, a scene of ice-covered mountains all around us, a beautiful yellow sky as the sun rose, and a temperature of -1 degrees. This morning after breakfast, we were out early at 9 a.m. to spend a couple of hours exploring Curtis Bay. We were looking at icebergs, little inlets, and the coastline around the bay. Everything looked interesting. The mountainous hills were covered in ice to a depth of well over 50 metres, and in some places it was smooth, and in other places large cracks had appeared in the crevices and became a brilliant blue colour. After lunch, the ship had repositioned and we set out for a landing at Michelson Harbour. A little way off the shore was a small island with a red Argentinian refuge hut. There was a gentoo penguin colony and some old whaling relics. We could walk around as long as we were careful not to disturb the penguins that were molting. These stood on rocky outcrops rather than in the ice. The gentoo penguins are the first penguins to revisit Antarctica every season to start breeding. At this time, the penguin chicks were almost fully grown, but still being fed by their parents. We watched many of them hassling their parents for food and reaching right down their throat to get food from their crop. At night, we witnessed a spectacular Antarctic sunset. The sun set behind a mountain range in a burst of orange light and lit up the sky and mountains on the other side of the strait in colours of pink and purple. On February the 21st, we awoke to find ourselves in Wilhelmina Bay, in the northern end of the Antarctic Peninsula. The weather was sunny, the sky was blue, and the air temperature was -1 degrees. We were off in Zodiacs to watch whales by 7 a.m. before breakfast. This bay is noted as a place for finding them. Humpbacks forage here over summer on the plentiful supplies of krill before they migrate north to breed. They live off their body fat until they return again to Antarctica in the following season. We must have seen 10 whales during our 2-hour Zodiac cruise, and I snagged a number of good photos of their tails as they were diving. The whales would float on the surface, take a few big blows, and then dive with their typical humpback out of the water and show their tail flukes. A few minutes later, they would resurface somewhere nearby. On some of the floating icebergs, we could see cute chinstrap and gentoo penguins, as well as a few crab-eater seals that were hauled out for a rest. We had a little drama late in our cruise around the bay. We were driving over some brash ice, that's the chunks of wind-blown ice from the glaciers, and when we had a large sharp piece cut a hole in a part of our Zodiac pontoon. It deflated with a loud bang, and a couple of people were slightly injured. We were a bit over a kilometre from the ship, and some of the other Zodiacs came to our aid and took her and a couple of other people off back to the ship and to the doctor. Zodiacs are well-designed craft and can remain afloat even if 3 sections of their pontoon are ruptured. A few of the group, including me, stayed on the Zodiac while we travelled slowly back to the ship. There was a 6-foot gash in the pontoon, and the whole thing will now have to be replaced. It's going to be out of action for the rest of this season. Just as all this occurred, a very curious minke whale slid right under our Zodiac and surfaced just a few metres away, as if it was having a look at our plight. We couldn't do a second Zodiac trip around the bay because it was becoming full of small chunks of ice that were being pushed in by the wind. Instead, we stood in the bow of the ship as it cruised through about 4 nautical miles of ice very slowly out into Gerlache Strait. It was fun being right in the bow as we crunched through the ice and occasionally disrupted a seal or two that was sleeping on some of the larger blocks. The captain was very unimpressed as he had just had the ship painted, and this ice will cause some severe scratching to his new paint job. We spent the afternoon in Paradise Harbour. This is a stunning deep harbour surrounded by mountains and glaciers. The scenery is just fantastic. I've taken over 800 photos in the last 2 days, but I won't inflict them all on you in this presentation. Our dinner tonight was a barbecue on the back deck of the ship. The chef set up a wood-fired barbecue with beef and prawns and hot dogs. Mulled wine was very plentiful, and the dessert continued of pecan pie. We witnessed a superb sunset of the golden light on the mountains around the harbour. Golden snow and clear reflections in the calm water were just superb. February the 22nd was our last day in Antarctica. It started at 6 o'clock in the morning with a wake-up call as we entered the Lemaire Channel. This is a narrow waterway that stretches for about 6 nautical miles between the continental mainland and Booth Island. It's incredibly scenic with high mountains on either side and ice-covered valleys. To top this off, the sun was rising as we travelled, and we were blessed with golden sunlight appearing on the mountains. It was quite cold and the decks were slippery. We travelled through here slowly because there was quite an amount of ice in the seaway, and this gave us a bonus of being able to spend more time in this very beautiful place. We were back inside for breakfast, and then we were out again at 10 a.m. for a Zodiac cruise around Plano Island, where dozens of large icebergs are blown in from the Weddell Sea, and they come here to die. They were all different shapes and colours and sizes. One had a large arch that must have been 30 metres high. Another one looked like a dairy frost ice cream with a spiral of gentle rounded curves. Others looked like dragons and every other imaginable shape that you can think of. There were no accidents with the Zodiac today, thankfully. We were just able to enjoy the majesty of the ice and the blue colours that they contained. We saw some Weddell seals hauled out on an iceberg, and at one stage one popped its head out of the water right next to our Zodiac. It was full of curiosity. The Zodiac drivers had their paddles ready to beat it off in case it started to bite into the boat. We also saw a Weddell seal. Our very last stop before leaving the White Continent was at Petermann Island. This is a 2-kilometre square island with both a gentoo and a Adelie penguin colony on it. The Adelie penguin is the bog standard one that is just simply black and white. Most of the chicks were fully grown and the adult birds were going through their annual molt. This made them look very bedraggled and sad and sorry. There's a red hut and a cross on the island which acts as a memorial to 2 early British explorers who died nearby. Another feature of the rocks on this island is that many are split vertically. They are of some form of grained igneous rock, granite I think, and when the water gets into the cavities and freezes, it splits the rock. 4 p.m. we were back on the ship, and we'll now head out to sea for our return trip to Ushuaia. We're a fair way south, and it will probably take us 2 days to get back across the Drake Passage. We had a fair bit of time to unwind on our way back to Ushuaia, celebrating all the things we'd seen and watching dolphins occasionally off the bow as they swam beneath the ship. We had an opportunity to explore the ship. While the expedition crew were all English speakers, the operating crew of the boat were Russians. It was owned by an academic institute in Kaliningrad and was built in 1980 in Finland to spy on American submarines during the Cold War. The area where we got changed each day, the mudroom, to go outside into our Zodiacs, was where they used to submerge a listening device to see if they could pick up any sounds from the submarines. The engine room is completely Russian, and while some of it looked a little antiquated to me, the crew told me that it is essentially modern and a very capable ship. Our first sight of land as this cruise ended was at Cape Horn. This is famous in the old sailing ship days as a place where ships would beat for weeks or a month even to try and around this piece of land against the wind. We weren't allowed to stop and visit here because we'd sailed out of Argentina, and there is some animosity with the Chileans who actually own Cape Horn. We could only watch it as we sailed past before we docked back in Ushuaia to finish our voyage. I hope you enjoyed this presentation. It's taken me a couple of days to put it together, but I've learned something about some new software and I enjoyed reminiscing about my trip. It took me just on 40 hours to get home from Ushuaia to my front door, but I'd go tomorrow if I had the chance again.